these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
You know, when we say innovation, we usually define it as being able to do more with less. But it seems that in the current energy policy environment, especially with this administration and the governments of Europe, it's the opposite. They want to do less and with more. It seems like a lot of their policies and financial decision making are directing capital away from energy-dense, affordable energy sources, things like natural gas and oil, of course, and directing them towards less powerful and less dense energy sources that are intermittent, like green energy, solar and wind specifically, just because they have lower carbon emissions. And that's, of course, had some major effects. You've seen protests in the Netherlands. You've seen Sri Lanka basically collapse because of the UN's attack on basic fertilizers for farmers. You're seeing this attack on the basic needs of people, whether that's energy, food, or water. And I want to discuss this and its global impact, the global industry, the energy industry, with my friend and constituent, actually, in my new district anyway, Peter Huntsman. Peter, thanks for being on.
Dan, very nice to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, so you're CEO of Huntsman Corporation. Let's start there. I mean, what do you all do at Huntsman, and how are you involved in this enormous conversation about global energy?
Well, we're a $10 billion chemical materials company. Figure that about 40% of our sales are in North America, 30% are in Europe, and 30% are in China and the Asian markets. And so we're being acutely affected in our European markets. We're seeing firsthand what is happening when you have an energy policy, when you become 100% reliant on a third-party country or entity, especially one that you felt you trusted, as the Germans did Russia. Mm-hmm. Much of Europe has outsourced their energy, if you will, or come up with a very unreliable source of energy, which is a lot of the green energy. Is a place for that. But so, as a company, we've got thousands of jobs that are kind of in the balance right now in Europe. I see some very troubling trends in North America that are kind of heading in that same direction, and so it's getting to be a very complicated situation, and I don't see it getting much better anytime soon. So
let's educate the audience on energy markets in Europe versus the United States. You know, how do they get their energy? Why are they facing more of a crisis than we are? Is it because they have to import more? Is it and how much is it to do with their own energy policies? What energy they've decided to subsidize and prioritize versus what they've tried to minimize, and how much of it has to do with the war in Ukraine, with Russia invading Ukraine?
Well, that's all very, very good question, rather complex, and I'll try to answer it very quickly as I can. But let's instead of trying to take the entirety of Europe, let's just take Germany. Mm-hmm. Germany is roughly 25-30% of the entire GDP of Europe.
Yeah.
Germany is the third largest economy, sometimes Japan, Germany, depending on foreign exchange rates and so forth. Germany is the third largest economy in the world. Now let that sink in for just a second. Third largest economy in the world. They outsource 97% of their hydrocarbon energy.
Wow.
97%. And so when you think about that, just think about this for a second. 55% of their gas comes from Russia. 50% of their coal comes from Russia. 35% of their oil comes from Russia. So they're almost a vestige state of Russia, if you will. So when Russia invades Ukraine and Germany doesn't do their bidding, guess what they're doing right now? You're seeing the price of energy and gas go up 10, 20 times. But let's not, one of the narratives, of false narratives I think you hear over and over again, was this crisis in Europe is brought about because of Russia invading Ukraine. The simple fact of the matter is the winter and the spring before this whole thing happened, before the invasion happened, energy prices in Germany were up 10 times over the previous year.
Yeah.
10 times.
It's crazy.
Electricity was up 15 times. So, that was because of their reliance on wind, over-reliance on wind. I think wind has a very important role to play, but remember, you're paying twice for it, right? You're putting in the wind, and then you have to have 100% backup because it's not that wind runs off and on at 80 to 90%. It either is running or it's not running at all. When it's not running at all, you've got to have 100% backup. So you're essentially paying twice for all this stuff. And so when you think about it, there's not been an economy that's transitioned to wind that has become more competitive, where energy prices have come down. So you look at Europe in its totality, it's become over-reliant on third-party sourcing, mostly Russia and Germany in particular. And that's where you're seeing the biggest problems today.
If they wanted to drill for gas and oil, could they? Do they have those? Do they have that? Does the geology allow for that there?
Well, most of these countries, strangely enough, banned fracking. Not even banned fracking. They banned experimenting, even doing trial runs with fracking.
Because they got plenty of gas, say in the UK, I think, right?
And where there's coal, usually, and all these countries are very, very rich in coal. I mean, it's amazing. I think that Germany shut down their last coal mine 4 years ago. And now they're buying, like I said earlier, they're buying half their coal from Russia. Yeah. But they can't buy because of sanctions. So what's Russia doing? Russia's sending its coal to Africa. Africa used to buy from Australia. Australia now sends its coal to Germany. And so instead of having Russia send its coal literally across Poland into Germany, it now sends its coal clear down to Africa. And Australia sending it halfway around the world. I mean, think of the CO2 footprint just in...
But it doesn't count towards however they're measuring it. However the green activists are measuring it in Europe, it doesn't count.
No, and because they're out of gas, essentially, out of natural gas. So Germany has been, year on year, for the last 15 years, has been using less and less coal. They're slated to use zero coal here in the next 5 or 6 years. From last year to this year, they will actually increase and go back where they were about 7 years ago.
Really?
And so this last 7 years of progress of going into all that $1 trillion of investment into wind subsidy, taxes, and so forth. Again, I want to be clear, because we supply the wind industry raw materials. You don't make wind without oil. You don't make solar panels without oil.
Right.
And so we supply those raw materials, but it's got to be a balanced approach in all these things.
Yeah, and I was curious how that actually works. When they go back to using the same amount of coal they did 7 years ago, does that mean they're just dusting off these old coal power plants that they'd shut down and just putting coal back thbecause and hooking them back up to the grid? Exactly. I'm curious what it means. Like, is that what it means?
It's exactly what it means. So I was in because
that's a massive undertaking.
Oh, it is.
It doesn't require does it require their government to change the law? I mean, because I'm assuming they sort of outlawed it.
That's right. You're absolutely right. So they're desperate. I was in Cologne a couple of weeks ago, and I stood at the top of a building with the CEO in the chemical industry, and we looked off in the horizon. There's this big plume of black smoke that was coming up, and he said that's a coal-fired power plant that has been shut down for nearly 20 years.
Okay.
And he said they're trying to restart it. And I said, how's it going? And he said they literally are going into retirement homes. Because how many
coal miners?
How many 30-year-olds know how to run a coal plant that shut down 20 years ago? And he said not only that, but they're having to go out and scour the industry for spare parts, vacuum tubes. Think of the wiring that went in. These are 1950s coal plants. So were shut down 20 years ago. Yeah. They ran their 40, 50 years. They were old in the 80s and 90s.
Surprised they weren't demolished.
And in some cases they were, but some of them they just put them in standby. Just around. And they operated on standby permits, meaning they were given exemptions to run under environmental laws that were 20 years ago. Yeah. So now they've got to go back and completely.
It's crazy.
I mean, it's just crazy. It's absolutely crazy, and it's all avoidable.
Yeah. The other thing they do is the wood burning, right? Which is seen by environmentalists as this zero carbon solution. I understand why they claim that. But the math doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But how are you familiar with that off the top of your head? Like how much of their it's not a whole lot, but I was reading articles where they're running out of basic firewood in Poland and throughout Europe because everybody's basically panic buying. It was like 2020 with toilet paper. Everybody's panic buying. I don't know why toilet paper, by the way, was the one thing everybody thought they needed more than anything else. I could think of so many other important items that I need in an apocalypse. But that's
probably that's a podcast in and of itself. I won't even go down that road.
I mean, that was just the weirdest thing. But firewood, I get. That does seem like something I would panic buy, especially when winter's coming and. They're just running out. But it's nonsense because they do view this as a zero carbon kind of fuel when it's really not.
Well, it's not, and it's not because there are a number of states everywhere from on the political spectrum from California to Utah that ban firewood being burned in homes now. I mean, they don't allow that. But in Germany, again, this year,
You can't have a fire like in Christmas in Utah?
no, only wood, not in Salt Lake City. If it's a new home, you cannot put wood burning.
Well, that's a little messed up.
Stove. Okay, I'm not going to argue. I've been in Texas.
It just seems like a nice thing to have in a cozy living
room
room
Texas
setting.
For 25 years.
Come on, Utah.
But as you think about it, though, the biomass makes up about 4%. And that's biomass is what they burn these forests, and then think how long
biomass sounds very green.
It sounds very green.
Yeah.
And then you think of the wood that goes in. The minister of the environmental minister told the German citizenry 2 weeks ago that they should be stocking up on firewood for this winter as an emergency precaution.
Yeah,
think of that.
Hence all the panic buying.
Yeah.
As far as carbon emissions go, isn't it pretty close to coal?
Yeah, well, wood is not very hot. I mean, we think it's hot when it burns, but it's nowhere near coal, and so it's not nearly as efficient as coal. As far as you couldn't run a power plant, you couldn't run furnaces with wood.
Right. Yeah, you just heat your home, but even that, but the carbon emissions themselves are still pretty high.
Right. You need a lot more wood on a per BTU basis.
Yeah, and so the argument they make to say that it's zero carbon is basically, we're burning this tree, but we planted another tree which cancels out the tree we just burned up. That's why they call it like long-term zero carbon. That's the argument.
And they're right. If you take that tree over the 40-year,
in 40 years it'll be carbon neutral.
40 years it'll be carbon neutral. That's absurd.
Yeah, it really.
You can run that same argument with oil, by the way, if you want to wait a couple 100 million years. So
that's true. That's true. Oil is carbon neutral in a couple 100 million years. So I haven't seen a lot of wake-up calls on the policy level here in our country. This administration seems to keep doubling down on their bad ideas and their attacks on the industry. This recent bill passed at about $25 billion in new taxes on the industry. So I don't know how they think that means they're going to drill more and invest more and lower prices. It obviously doesn't. But what about Europe? It does seem to me like their wake-up call has come a little sooner. Is that accurate, or is that just a perception from various headlines I've seen where it's like, they're reopening coal plants, they're looking at nuclear again, even though that for some reason the environmentalist left hates nuclear. I've never understood that one. What are your thoughts, just having business there? I was over there last fall again. Let's remember, as I said earlier, before Putin ever invaded, the ironic thing, I don't even go down this path, but think of this: at less than 2 months before Putin invades Ukraine, we have all these billionaires, everybody telling us how to live their life. They all fly their planes into Scotland. Mm-hmm. The big news is there's enough space to park all these private jets. They all fly into Scotland, and they all tell us how we're going to live our lives at the very moment that Putin is over amassing an army. We were so inept at our intelligence. We were so inept at reading the diplomacy of issues and so forth that we completely missed this. I mean, within a matter of weeks, Putin is invading a country, and you have the largest conflagration since World War II. It's like, there's no way he'll do it. I know, yes, he did it like 8 years ago. Yes, he's amassing an army. Yes, he's always talking about how Ukraine belongs to Russia, but he's definitely not going to do it. I mean, it was crazy. Like, you're right. I didn't understand how they missed it.
I know some of your listeners will end up thinking that I'm complimenting Putin. I'm really not. In some ways, he's one of the more honest brokers. He said he was going to go into Syria, and he did. He said he was going to go into Libya. He did. Chechnya, he did. Ukraine.
He's not 4D chess guy.
No,
right?
he's not.
It's a very predictable,
he's
authoritarian dictator, kind of in a sense. He wants to bring back that czarist feeling of Russia and gaining territory.
And let's straighten out the borders while we're at it.
Right. No, it's very old school thinking, because like before the Bretton Woods Agreement, before the end of World War II, the world was a very different place where it wasn't this sort of free trade global order. Putin likes that other world because he likes to be able to use force to take things as opposed to negotiate and make deals and then trade with somebody. He'd rather just have leverage and force, and it's just, it's a very, right. It is predictable.
It is. And he has no problem showing his hand because of the chaos that entails and then actually doing it. In the West, we always like to think we can talk somebody out of it. We can look and see their soul through their eyes or something. Like that.
Appeal to their better nature.
But I think that I personally think there's a real revolution. You look at the parties that are taking place right now in Europe. Mm-hmm. It's the rise of the far right and the far left. You have the far left that right now in Europe is arguing, this is what's needed. We need to go through a painful awakening because we have to save the world. And this is how we're going to do it. We're going to make hydrocarbons. We're going to have to go through unemployment. We may have a generation here of just a lot of pain. Of course, it's the poor and it's the working, it's the middle class that's going to pay for it.
No, they're an anti-humanist argument. They're actually pretty transparent about it.
They are.
Like, don't have kids. You're a scourge on the earth. You shouldn't even be here. And we should be going through this pain. At least they're honest about
They
it.
are, and they get who they get their advice from, Greta and so forth. And it's a very emotional. And on the far right, you're saying, look, we're not going to pay for Ukraine's and Russia's war. Ukraine was one of the most corrupt countries in the war the day before, one of the most corrupt countries in the world the day before the invasion. Human trafficking, drugs, counterfeiting, and so forth. Why are we paying the price in Germany? Why am I being laid off? Why are the farmers in the Netherlands rebelling? Why is the debt in Italy going through the roof? Why are we going through all these calamities? We need to get back to a nationalistic, so you're seeing the far right in Italy, you've seen the far right in the Netherlands, in Germany also rise. And so this is becoming extremely polarizing in Europe.
Yeah.
And it's going to get a lot worse. I think this winter, unless you somehow the environmentalist dream come true and you have a really warm winter.
Yeah.
I mean, other than that, I don't care how much gas. You've only got about 8 weeks of storage.
They're screwed. And the reason I asked too is because they did do other things, right? Like immediately as Putin invaded, they immediately approved like at least 2 natural gas import terminals in Germany. The question is why can't we start permitting more on our side, permitting more pipelines, obviously permitting federal leases for oil and gas exploration. Well, of course, we're not doing any of it, and doesn't seem to be showing any signs of doing it.
Well, but we are being affected. So just think of the U.S. for a second. We today, the natural gas price in the U.S. is $10 per MMBTU. There was one time in 2000 where the price of gas was as expensive as it is today. And that's back, remember when Enron was manipulating the price of natural gas. This is 20 years ago. Gray Davis in California lost his job and they put Arnold Schwarzenegger. That was all because of natural gas, the manipulation of natural gas. And people went to jail over that. Now we have government policy in this country where we're saying we're going to export our resources, but we're not going to have any more of it. So we're not going to produce any more gas, but we're going to be exporting. And I mean, I hate to say this, I'm a free trader, but why on earth are we're giving away our natural gas? We're giving away our utility. We're giving away our raw materials to solve Europe's problem. And we Americans, a year ago, our gas was $2 per MMBTU. It's almost 10 today. We've seen almost a 5-fold in our energy prices. And we're going to see that this winter when our utility prices and our utility costs go up through the roof.
Yeah, well, but that's an interesting debate because I mean the oil and gas industry would not necessarily agree that they want an export ban, and so it's an interesting debate, right? And
I'm all for exporting, but let's make sure that we're producing enough to be able to satisfy American industry, American manufacturing, productivity. This is a hydrocarbon that goes into everything from pharmaceutical drugs all the way through to windmills. And
but the argument goes, if you stopped exporting because for the reasons you stated, right? Like the price is too high, and why can't and you use their product for your feedstock, and it's expensive right now. Of course, their argument would be if you don't let us export, then that capital investment drying up that we were already worried about, now we're really, really worried about it, and you're going to get even less production, and it won't solve anything. And they would argue when we lifted the export ban, you saw prices drop because the production increased. But to your point, you got to have that production increase. You got to allow the production increase.
I'll just give one counterpoint to that. When the Freeport export facility had an explosion here a couple months ago, shut down, and stopped exporting. This is one of the largest exporting facilities in North America. Yeah. The next day, the price in the United States dropped 30%.
That's true.
So all that gas came back in. So it's not this really, in my opinion, is not a question of should we or shouldn't we be exporting. It's should we allow gas production to take place in this country unfettered. We ought to have a Marshall program where we're saying we're willing to export, but we also want to make sure that our American jobs and American industry and people that are paying their power bills on a monthly basis, they don't have to pay more than they have to. We are paying 5 times more today than we were just a few months ago because we have a president and administration that won't unhinge and won't unlock that drilling capacity. We still have permits on drilling. We have permits on pipelines, export facilities. The faster that we can do that, there ought to be a Marshall Program in this country on energy.
Yeah, and because I don't think anyone wants the sort of back and forth, like because there was another argument made by smaller producers that we shouldn't be importing any oil and gas when prices were too low, and so because the lower prices or higher prices benefit and hurt different segments of the American economy, and so the solution that everybody could agree on is don't screw up the production from at least a government standpoint. And that makes a lot of sense. You see pipeline cancellations. I just actually saw this. Toby Rice sent us this graph. Toby Rice from what's the name of his company in Pennsylvania? One of the biggest gas production company in the U.S. and sent us this graph of all of the pipeline permits that were approved over the last 20 years and what prices did accordingly. They go down, and then you see these massive increase in pipeline cancellations and permit cancellations. Pretty much 2019, 2020, as soon as Biden took office, and you see prices spike. It's not rocket science.
So on one side of the Appalachian, you have almost unlimited, unfettered gas that's being produced. On the east side of the Appalachians, in Boston and these places, they won't let the pipelines. The pipeline's already there. They just won't give them the operating permits. They're importing natural gas from overseas, from the Middle East.
Yeah.
As well as I, the last time we talked, we were talking about how natural gas produced in the Middle East in Russia, typically has 30% more leakage, CO2 escape. It's environmentally damaging. They're importing natural gas into Boston. And we're on the other side of the Appalachians. We're putting it back in the ground. We got so much of it.
Right.
It's astounding. We can't even move it.
Nuts. That was another statistic I saw today. I think in the last month, like nine arrivals from a specific ship that goes back and forth between Boston and Trinidad and Tobago. It's just bringing in gas because they need it. And it's like you're not any greener just because you use someone else's gas that they manufactured. But this is sort of the shell game that they like to play.
Dan, we talk about shell games. Think about this one: 6%, the largest importer that's filling the missing void in Europe, according to the Financial Times, China. Now, China is not an exporter of natural gas. They have cargoes of natural gas that are coming in. They're literally taking the gas off the ship, according to the Financial Times. This isn't some right wing, and they're putting on another ship. The ship's going all the way to Europe. You know where that natural gas is coming from?
Selling it at higher.
It's Russian. It's Russian gas coming into China. Take it off, put it on, and ship it to Europe. I mean, this is the lunacy. This is when we talk about coal going from Australia to Europe. We talk about crude oil that goes from Russia to India, India to Europe. I mean, it's lunacy. All of this stuff is. And we're killing the environment in the process of doing it. It's such hypocrisy.
Netherlands, I don't know how involved you are or knowledgeable about what's been going on in the Netherlands and farming in Sri Lanka. Is that something we could chat about?
Our largest facility in Europe is in Rotterdam, so it's something I'm very familiar with.
I mean, it's great. It's like this is why I opened it up with this sort of attack on basic needs. That these policies are getting dangerous. I think for a while they were just kind of silly, and we could just laugh at these crazy environmentalists doing crazy things, but you start to screw with basic needs like energy and food production. I would say water on top of that because of their attacks on the chemical industry in general, and chlorine production in particular. It's sort of a separate conversation. But yeah, what Netherlands? Maybe walk us through what happened in the Netherlands. Why there was all these protests? What's this attack on using fertilizer to make food? God forbid.
So the Netherlands is sued by an NGO. This is a group that's not even in the Netherlands. Sue the government that they have to reduce their carbon footprint by X amount. The prime minister ends up signing into legislation in protest, but he wants to comply with the NGO so he doesn't get the wrath of the NGOs against him. And in order to do this, over the next 5 to 10 years, they're going to have to shut down 1/3 of farming capacity in the Netherlands.
And on what basis was this lawsuit? Was it because the Netherlands agreed to some international agreement or something?
The people of the Netherlands, their human rights were being violated by environmental statutes that weren't being followed. Netherlands, one of the greenest countries to begin with, and one of the windiest countries, by the way. So anything they are emitting ends up in France and Germany anyways. It probably isn't all that big of a loss. But so you end up seeing all these farmers now protesting, because basically what they're doing is they're going to the farmers and saying, you need to shut down a third of your land. You need to have a third of your livestock needs to be eliminated. And again, what's that going to do to food prices? It's the same lunacy you've got in this taking place in Sri Lanka. Here you have a country of 21 million people. The average income is $20 a day in Sri Lanka. And the Prime Minister runs in 2019 on the promise that if I'm elected, we're going to go to green chemistry. We're going to go to green fertilizers. This is going to make all of our farmers, our organic food will sell for twice as much.
It's like the pseudoscience craziness too.
Yeah, the world's going to be willing to pay twice as much for the food.
Yeah.
And again, this isn't a country where the people earn $20 a day on average. They don't have any green fertilizers. They ban all industrial fertilizers, all urea, which is basically nitrogen and air, right?
And their argument is it's nitrogen pollution, nitrogen runoff.
It comes from an industry.
Yeah.
And so the food crop that year goes down more than 50% in Sri Lanka. They don't even have enough to feed their people. Yep. The tea crop fails, rubber crop fails. Those are the two biggest exports from Sri Lanka. Those both fail, and now you've got a collapse in the government. Hyperinflation, 90% per month, 10 times higher than what we're seeing here in the United States. On a people that are earning $20 a day. So that 90% inflation, their buying power is being literally cut in half every day, or every month.
Oh, it's crazy. And hopefully it's a wake up call to a lot of other countries that might be listening to the UN. Because I think this started with the UN. The UN Environmental Program has this sort of anti-industrial fertilizer bent to it, and they seem to use a bunch of pseudoscience to make that happen.
That's right.
And I don't understand how it gains so much traction. Okay, let's move on to ESG and how worried are you about ESG? Do you guys have an ESG rating? Is it good? I mean, I can't imagine.
Yeah, I used to get asked all the time, tell us about what you're doing with ESG. Tell us what you're doing with ESG. And I started asking, so we get asked by a lot of investors and analysts occasionally. I was going to say, I spend probably 20% of my time on the road meeting with investors, meeting with analysts, meeting with bankers, financial institutions, so forth. And I probably get one question out of 100 on ESG. I finally started asking back, what would you like to know about ESG? Dan, I've never had a person that can answer that question. I think they're going through a checklist. Did I ask them about ESG? Yes, I did. And they said, everything's fine. We're good.
Nobody actually cares.
There is no. And you'll remember, what was it, 4 years ago? Remember every company in America had to have 3 women on their board? And a year later, that changed, and then we came out with Black Lives Matter, and then it was about social justice, and then we came out a year later about save the porpoises or whatever. So there is no standard on what ESG is. I mean, and that's the problem with it. It's such a subjective standard. Yeah. Again, I'm not.
Well, and there's companies that make a lot of money being the arbiter of the ESG standard and giving you a point, some kind of point system that they can tell investors. And, I'm always wondering how much that really affects your investment, how much it doesn't. Maybe it depends on the company.
In our industry, I'm not sure that it does, but look what it's done to the oil and gas industry. When you have a president of the United States that stands up during the campaign and he said, I think oil and gas CEOs ought to be in jail. On what charge? They just ought to be in jail.
Just in jail.
And you have an administration where the Secretary of the Environment says that we need to limit funding, that the Federal Reserve shouldn't be giving loans out to hydrocarbon, to oil and gas producing companies. And again, these are not idle threats. Interest rates, cost of capital, and so forth.
Right.
This is why we've seen, again, this is not a theory. It's why we've seen, in part, our own energy costs in this country. We have 1,000 years of supply sitting under the ground, and we've seen prices go up 5-fold in less than a year.
And what would be the right set of tools, strategies to counter ESG investment? Because the thing is, if it was a law, we could be like, we're going to repeal the law, but it's not a law. It's like this subjective cultural movement. Now, Democrats are trying to make it into law in various ways, one of which through SEC rulemaking, but I don't think they'll be successful in that. But given that it's sort of this weird subjective investment culture movement, what would you suggest the best way to counter it?
Well, I think that investors ought to know what's first of all, we publish literally hundreds of pages a year about where our money is. You can look on our filings. You can see how many miles I drive in a company car every year. I mean, we give such detail. If investors were to read the available information, I think they'd have a pretty good idea.
Yeah.
But when let me just give you an example. When we talk about what the SEC is talking about doing now, they're going to an oil company and saying, you need to be responsible for the products that you sell and what they do. So you're an oil company.
Yeah.
You sell product out of Shell oil stations. Somebody pulls up in an old 5 mile per gallon clunker. Is your product going to go into that? Are you responsible for that? Are you responsible for the CO2 footprint that the 50 mile per gallon car pulls up behind?
Right.
Are you going to give them a discount? It's a brand new car. Are you going to give, if I sell my product to them, I've got a higher ESG rating. If I sell to the guy that's driving the old pickup truck, I'm going to get a lower ESG rating because I'm going to be responsible with the gasoline. Can the government eventually get that point? Of course they can. When you pull to a gas station, you swipe your card. This is my car. This is my truck. Here's my ESG rating. We do this to a large degree in China already with social scores about how compliant people are and so forth. So when you think about, I'm not trying to sound like a conspiratorialist, but when you think about this ESG, how far do you go? And you want to hold a company responsible for their products. It just goes down so many roads of taxation of nebulous costs and controls and so forth.
Yeah,
it's there's no end to it.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily value based either. It's not profitable. The ESG proponents will claim that it is, but I think you look at the way they analyze it. They're really just taking companies that would be successful either way.
Oh, yeah.
And saying, see how successful it is, and because of ESG, it's like, no, you just it was going to be successful with or without it because it's a good product or whatever the case may be, and they're very tricky with how they try to manipulate it.
It's kind of like what you were saying earlier about the coal that comes from Australia versus the coal that comes from purely from a CO2 point of view. Does Germany get all that extra CO2 that's being burned? Does that go against their ratings?
Right.
No, it doesn't. Does an Apple? The amount of that people are putting in the cloud and so forth. The cloud itself uses twice the amount of energy and CO2 emissions that this country of Japan does.
So maybe we'll wrap up with we got to wrap up soon. We're running out of time, but maybe with a general conversation. One of the concerns I have looking at just how the Democrats think in general. Is this they like to have a lot of nice things, but they don't want to have or produce the things that make the nice things. Your basic needs, your basic materials. You want to blanket our lovely landscapes and wind turbines and solar panels, but you don't want to build or produce or mine for any of the things that actually build this stuff. And so, we do seem to run the risk of moving towards this. Very highly prioritized green energy mix, solar and wind, that we don't produce any of it because we don't want to do mining we don't allow any mining permits to go through. We don't want to mine copper to build all the new transmission lines that you would need to build to take that electricity from wherever that solar panel farm is to wherever you actually need the electricity. And so you're going to end up with this electrical grid that's dependent on China, which doesn't even really produce anything. They're middlemen for basically everything, and that would be a pretty sad state of affairs. Kind of, it almost looks like the Democrats want to push us right into the problem that Germany is faced with Russia.
Yeah, we again, this is a whole nother podcast. Just getting into rare earth elements. Mm-hmm. There are 14, 15 rare earth elements. Chinese control nearly 70% of the global trade.
Yeah.
The United States and the rest of the world kind of carve up the rest of that. And a big chunk of the rest of that are ores that are coming out of Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and places in Central Asia. And they're processed in China where there's no environmental oversight. There's no environmental laws that are being enforced and so forth. So essentially, you're looking at 75 to 80% of the end products and marketing of these rare earth elements. So when we talk about rare earth elements, I'm not talking about, I'm talking here about your phones, your computers, your laptops. all the telecommunications, satellites, everything, magnets that go into everything. It's
the other frustrating thing about rare earth elements. They're not exactly that rare, are they?
No.
They're easy to get.
No,
you just got to choose to do it.
You just got to dig the hell out of everything, right? And so you've got a lot of waste. You've got a lot of byproduct,
and that's what our American environmentalists, European environmentalists don't like.
And if
they want to have all the metals.
Yep.
They don't want to see how it's made. It's like, I want the hot dog, but I don't want to see how it's made because then I won't like the hot dog anymore. Is it kind of like? It seems like it's kind of like that.
You're exactly right, and I don't want to end on a dour note because we've got so much technology. I'm not talking just about our company, but the one thing that always disappoints me when I speak to my Democratic friends is the lack of optimism they have in technology, the lack of optimism they have in innovation, entrepreneurship, and science.
Yeah.
And you look at the problems of the world today, so many of them are going to be solved much quicker, much cheaper, and much easier. I'm thinking about the bet that was made here in the Woodlands some 50 some odd years ago between Simon and Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich, who wrote the book The Population Bomb. Remember, he wrote that in 1980 that there'd be hundreds of millions of people that would be dead by the year 2000 and so forth. And they made this great bet between Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich. And Julian Simon told Paul Ehrlich, you pick 5 commodities in 1980, and I'll bet you by 1990, all 5 of those are cheaper than they are today. Paul Ehrlich picked the 5 commodities. They were nickel, tin, tungsten, copper, and chromium. Those were the 5. 10 years later, he ended up having to pay him the difference of the cost. And all 5 of those commodities had gone down a decade later.
Right.
And we almost seem like we have an element in society today that has lost faith in innovation, lost faith in science, lost faith in our ability to move forward on these things.
That's a good point. And another one that stands out to me, reading about the Western states' problem with drought and their water problem in the Colorado River and everything going on there. We clearly do not have that problem here in Houston. It's been raining a lot lately, but they do. But one of the things that stood out to me was a little blurb in a story I read about Las Vegas and how, while their population has increased by X percentage, quite a bit, maybe 400,000 people, something like that, their water usage over the last 20, 30 years has decreased. Like total, not proportion to the people living there, but total decrease but not an insignificant amount. I can't remember what it was off the top of my head, but technology does get you out of this. You guys at Huntsman actually do quite a bit on this front. I've always fascinated by your ability to take plastic water bottles and turn them into insulation.
Home insulation products. Right. Well, I can categorically say on every product we produce today, we produce it cleaner with less emissions, less byproducts than we did 10 years ago, categorically across the board. Environmental laws, and I don't condemn those. Environmental laws get tighter and tighter every year, and we keep up with it. That's what innovation's all about. We make things lighter, we make things better, we make things cheaper, and
there's a healthy amount of regulation that can make things better. But there's a problem with the philosophy that if one regulation is good, then 10 more must be better. And there's a diminishing return.
When we see regulation get to the point where it crimps the supply of our raw materials, for instance, of natural gas. So I think I think back in 1972 when Nixon put the EPA together, that was a Republican administration that put the EPA. The Potomac River was a dead river at that point. The Cuyahoga was regularly burning.
Right.
The environment we've got today is immensely cleaner than the environment that you and I grew up in as kids.
Well, there's a very clear correlation between the wealth of a country, the development of a country, and how clean it gets.
Absolutely.
And that's a whole other conversation too. Is how detrimental the radical environmentalists are to poorer nations that have a moral right to develop and take their people out of poverty. This idea that they can sort of leapfrog technology, skip the fossil fuel era, and move directly into a solar and wind economy it's nuts. It's debunked by economists.
Look at Sri Lanka.
It can't work. Yeah. But there's a movement that just I don't. It's hard to even get inside their heads. It's because it's anti-humanist. Like they literally don't believe in the human race, and it is very pessimistic. We should be more optimistic.
We should.
All right. On that note, Peter Huntsman, thank you for being on.
And always good to see you. Thank you very much.